Chapter 11. Morning Tea. The following day in the morning room, Tulip was working at some needlepoint while idly petting plants as the cat pawed at some spools of thread that fell onto her red velvet cushion. Nanny was talking, presumably to Tulip, about Mrs. Potts' cobbler and wondering how hard it would be to wrangle the recipe out of her, when Lumiere entered the room. "Excuse me, lovely ladies, but my dear Tulip, could you possibly spare your Nanny for a few moments? Mrs. Potts has arranged a little tea for Nanny downstairs. I think she is eager for your company, Nanny." Nanny looked at Lumiere with a sly grin. "And yes, Nanny, to be sure, she has baked a peach cobbler for the tea. She knows how fond you are of her cobblers." Nanny smiled. "Tulip, dear, you wouldn't mind, would you? You won't feel too lonely if Nanny slipped away for a spot of tea with old Mrs. Potts?" Tulip grinned at her Nanny and said, "Of course not. I have Flance to keep me company." And then, looking at Flance, she added, "Don't I, sweet girl?" Flance just looked at Tulip with her large black-rimmed golden eyes, tinted with tiny flakes of green, and blinked them slowly at her as if to say, "Yes. See, I will be fine. Go have your tea." And off Nanny went. Tulip didn't know what she would do without Nanny, but she knew, once she was married, she couldn't justify having her in the household. She would, of course, have a lady servant, someone to do her hair, to help her dress, to arrange her jewels, but it wouldn't be the same. She couldn't imagine sharing her feelings with anyone but Nanny. Perhaps, since she and Mrs. Potts had become so friendly, it wouldn't seem strange to keep Nanny on. She would have to talk to her mother about that when she returned from her trip. But what if her mother was unable to spare Nanny, or thought it was somehow inappropriate for Tulip to bring her along? That was just too dreadful to think of now. The prince peeked into the room, taking Tulip's mind off her future household concerns. She knew he didn't like Flance sitting on his fine cushions, but she couldn't help indulging the creature, and he didn't seem to notice. "Hello, my love. I have a little surprise for you. Do you think I can steal you away while we don't have Nanny to worry about? She's always snooping around and wondering where you are." Philip's face transformed into something shining and bright. She couldn't remember ever being so happy, not even when her father gave her Cupcake, her favorite horse. Oh, Cupcake! She couldn't wait to see her again. She wondered if the prince would object to Cupcake's coming to live here once they were married. So many things to think about. "Darling?" His voice brought Tulip out of her deep thoughts. "Oh, yes, dear, I'm sorry. I was just thinking about how much I love you and how sweet you are for asking Mrs. Potts to invite Nanny for tea so we could have some time together alone." The prince smiled. His feather head had puzzled out his ruse. What a surprise. "So you worked out my clever scheme. Aren't you a cunning girl?" he said. "Come now. I have something I would like to show you." "What is it?" Tulip squealed like an excited little girl. "You will just have to wait and see, my love. But first you will have to put this on." He handed her a long white piece of silk. She looked at him queerly. "It's a surprise, my love, trust me." He helped her tie the blindfold and led her to what she was sure was a courtyard. He let go of her hand and gently kissed her on the cheek. "Count to 50, my dear, and then take off the blindfold." He could see she was frightened. "My dear, you're trembling. There's nothing to fear. I will be waiting for you at the end of your journey." "My journey?" Her voice sounded small and confused. "It won't be a long journey, my princess, and the way will be quite clear. Now count to 50." She could hear his footfalls moving farther and farther away. She counted in her mind. It was silly to be so frightened, but she hated nothing more than the dark. Nanny had tried everything, but Tulip's relentless fear of darkness never diminished. She tried not to count too quickly so she wouldn't ruin the prince's surprise, but found herself becoming too fearful of the confining darkness. 48, 49, 50. She ripped the silk sash from her eyes. It took a moment for them to adjust before she saw the path laid before her. The tips of her toes touched the scattered pink rose petals that had been strewn across the courtyard to create a path that led right into the hedge maze. Her fears fluttered away. She quickly walked upon the petals, eager to venture into the maze constructed of animal topiaries. The petals led her past an exceptionally large serpent, its mouth gaping wide and bearing long, deadly fangs. The serpent twisted its way around the corner, revealing a part of the maze she'd never seen. It was a replica of the castle, almost exact in every way, except without the many griffins and gargoyles perched on every corner and turret. She imagined her future children playing here one day, laughing and making a game of the animals in the maze. What a lovely place this would be for children. She stopped her daydreaming and followed the rose petals past several whimsical animals, some of which she didn't know. She often felt cheated having been born a girl, not having had tutors like her brother had, or the freedom to explore the world. Women learned of the world through their fathers, their brothers, and, if they were lucky, their husbands. It didn't seem quite fair. She was accomplished for a girl. She knew how to sew, sing, paint, watercolors, and even play the harpsichord fairly well, but she could not name all the animals in what would soon be her own hedge maze. She felt stupid most of the time, and hoped others didn't see her in that light, but feared they usually did. Never mind that, she said to herself, and was surprised to see that the trail of petals led out of the hedge maze and away from the mysterious animals that made her feel foolish, and into a lovely garden she hadn't yet seen on her visits here. It was enclosed with a low semicircle wall, and within were lovely bright colored flowers. For a moment she thought she found herself stumbling upon a springtide. It was such a remarkable sight, so bright and full of light in the middle of the wintry landscape. She couldn't fathom how the flowers thrived in such bitter cold. Scattered among the flowers were beautiful statues, characters from legends and myths. She knew that much from listening in on her brother's lessons with his tutors before Nanny would take her away to practice walking. Practice walking, indeed. No wonder men didn't take women seriously. They had classes in walking while men learned ancient languages. The garden was stunning, and very much like a fairy tale, filled with the cold blue light of the winter afternoon. Nestled in the center of the enchanted garden, all pink and gold, was a stone bench, where her dearest was waiting for her, smiling with his hand outstretched. "It's so beautiful, my love. How is this possible?" The prince's smile broadened. "I arranged flowers from the hothouse to be moved here so you may experience the joy of spring." She sighed. "You're amazing, my dearest. Thank you," she said coyly, as she lowered her eyes to the flowers in the snow. The prince decided this was the moment when he would kiss her and break the curse. "May I kiss you, my love?" Tulip looked around, as if expecting her mother or Nanny to jump out from the hedge maze or pop out from behind a statue, and then deciding she didn't care if they did, she kissed him, and then she kissed him again and again. As they walked back to the castle, the prince seemed happier and more at ease than she'd ever known him to be. It was all so unexpected, this day, his attentiveness, everything that had happened on this visit, really. She felt much better about their upcoming marriage. She had been so worried before, and now she could hardly recall why. "Did you hear that, Tulip?" The prince's mood shifted from gleeful to panicked. "Hear what, dear?" She hadn't heard a thing, aside from the birds singing in the nearby snow-covered trees. That noise! It sounded like an animal, like a growl. Tulip laughed, making a joke of it. "Perhaps the hedge animals have come to life, and they are going to eat us alive." The prince looked as though he'd taken her jest quite seriously. His eyes were darting about as he tried to find the location of the wild beast. "You don't really think there is an animal in here with us, do you?" When she realized he was, in fact, serious, she became very frightened. "I don't know, Tulip. Stay right here. I'm going to check it out." "No, don't leave me here alone. I don't want to be eaten by whatever is prowling around in here." The prince was becoming very impatient. "You won't if you stay here like I've told you. Now be quiet and please let go of my hand." He ripped his hand away from hers before she could comply with his request, and she stood there frozen in fear as he dashed off looking for wild beasts. She sat there fretting for some time before the prince came back to her. "Oh my goodness!" she gasped. He was badly clawed across his forearm. Whatever had attacked him had clawed right through his jacket and left deep bloody wounds in his arm. "My love, you're hurt!" The prince looked stricken and angry. "Brilliant of you to have surmised that, my dear," he moaned. "What happened? What attacked you?" she said, trying not to let his bad temper affect her. "Clearly some sort of wild beast with sharp claws." She knew it was better to ask nothing more than to provoke him into further bitterness. "Let's get you back to the castle so we can have that taken care of." They walked back in silence. She felt like his attitude toward her had completely shifted again. She tried to put it out of her mind, but she couldn't help feeling his anger was directed at her and not at the beast that had attacked him. She wanted to cry, but she knew that would just make him angrier. So she walked back to the castle, saying nothing, hoping his temper would improve. Chapter 12. The Mystery of the Servants. Cogsworth did not greet them at the door as he normally did. Instead, it was the mayor. "Where's Cogsworth? I need him to fetch the doctor," the prince barked. Lumiere looked worried, but not just for his master. It seemed as if something else was going on, something he dreaded telling the prince. Of course, my lord, I shall take care of it. As he was walking away to have one of the porters send a message for the doctor, the prince said, "And send me Cogsworth." Lumiere stopped dead in his tracks, and it took him quite a few moments before he turned around to respond. "Well, sir, you see, we don't know where Cogsworth is." "What on earth are you talking about? You don't know where he is? He's always here. Go and find him at once and tell him I need him. Never mind, I will ring for him myself." He went to the mantel to pull the cord that summoned Cogsworth. "Excuse me, sir, but he's not here. We've searched the entire estate and we cannot find him. We're all very worried." The prince was going out of his mind with anger. "This is nonsense. Where on earth is the man? It's not like him to shirk his duties." "I know, sir. That is why we are all so worried. Mrs. Potts is in a heap of tears downstairs. She's had Chip looking everywhere for him. Everyone has been looking, sir." "Do you recall the last time you saw him?" He couldn't. "Come to think of it, I have not seen him all day." Tulip interjected. "This is very vexing, but I do think we should call the doctor, don't you? I'm worried about your arm, my love." Lumiere was rattled out of his panic for his friend Cogsworth and switched his focus to his master. "Yes, sir. I'd better take care of that first thing, and then we will arrange another search for Cogsworth." Chapter 13. The Bounder. The entire household was in a panic. Cogsworth was nowhere to be found, and now it seemed Mrs. Potts was also missing. "But, Nanny, it doesn't make sense. You were just having tea with her. Where in the world would she have gone off to?" Nanny's eyes were red from crying. "I don't know. I went to fetch us some more hot water for the tea. That Mrs. Potts is always bustling about, and I just wanted her to sit for a spell. You know that woman can't just sit down to enjoy a nice cup of tea without getting this or that for one person or another. But wouldn't you know it, once I returned with the water, she was gone. And the strangest thing, sitting there on the table was a pretty little teapot as round as can be." Tulip was confused. "Nanny, you were having tea. I don't understand why a pot upon the table would be so strange." Nanny said, "Ah, but you see, I had the teapot we were using, didn't I, to get the water, so why was there another just sitting on the table?" "That is strange, I suppose." Nanny's face crinkled up. "It's more than strange, girl. Something is happening in this house, something sinister. I felt it the first time we arrived, and now it's getting stronger." Tulip wasn't going to let Nanny get her worked up with her superstitious nonsense. She'd done it far too often in the past, and she wouldn't allow herself to be swept away by it again. Not now. "Oh, I know what you're thinking, girl. You think Nanny is an old, foolish woman, but I've been on this earth much longer than most, and I've seen things most people only dream of." Tulip rolled her eyes, but Nanny went on. "I'm telling you, I think this place is cursed." Both ladies looked up from their conversation when they heard Lumiere clearing his throat at the room's threshold. "I just wanted you to know the doctor has left and the prince is resting comfortably." "Will he be okay?" Tulip asked, worried. "Oh, yes, he will be fine. He's recovering and exhausted, that's all. I'm sure he will want to see you tomorrow," he said, smiling in an attempt to lighten the mood. "Tomorrow? Not today?" Tulip wondered, but she smiled back at Lumiere. She couldn't help it. There was something about him. "You needn't fuss over us this evening for dinner," she said. "You can just bring us something on a tray. We can eat in our rooms or perhaps next to the fire in the sitting room. I'm sure everyone is in a tizzy down there with Mrs. Potts and Cogsworth missing. I don't want you worrying over us." Nanny looked pleased with the job she had done raising Tulip. She sounded not only like a real queen, but a very compassionate one at that. But the flirty little Frenchman wouldn't hear of serving guests on trays in the sitting room or any other room aside from the dining hall. "Oh, no, that will not do. If Mrs. Potts were here, she would blow her lid at the thought of you two eating off trays. And as for the menu this evening, never fear, we have something special planned for you." He smiled another magical grin and said, "The dressing gong will be at 6 o'clock. Dinner at 8 o'clock. See you then." Then he was gone, likely dashing his way downstairs to arrange dinner and supervise the search for the missing servants. Tulip looked at her Nanny coyly. "You don't think the two of them snuck off together, Cogsworth and Mrs. Potts? You don't think they're in love?" Nanny laughed. "I wish it were as simple as that, my girl, but no. Neither of them gave me the slightest notion there was something between them. No, I fear something dreadful has happened to them. Tulip rolled her eyes again. Stop with all the talk of curses, Nanny. I won't have it. Later that night, in the main dining hall, you wouldn't have known two of the most important people on staff were missing. The room looked lovely, decorated with some of the hothouse flowers from Tulip's surprise earlier in the day, and the candles were sparkling brightly in crystal votive bowls, casting an unearthly light. The two ladies were enjoying their dessert when the prince stumbled into the room, looking half crazed. I'm happy you ladies are enjoying your meal while the entire household is falling into shambles around you. He looked terribly worn, as though he'd aged several years from the ordeal. Nanny and Tulip just stared at him, at a complete loss. Have you nothing to say for yourself, Tulip, sitting there stuffing yourself while my childhood companions are suffering such a terrible fate? Nanny spoke first. Here now, I won't have you speaking to her like that. She's been worried sick over them, and you. We both have. His face turned into something inhuman, something wicked and cruel. Nanny feared the prince was losing his mind. Don't look at me like that, old woman. I won't have you casting evil looks at me. And you! He turned his anger on Tulip. You lying strumpet, playing with my emotions, pretending you love me when clearly you do not. Tulip gasped and melted into tears at once, hardly able to speak. That's not true. I do love you. The prince's face was ashen, his eyes sunken and dark with illness, his anger growing with every word. If you loved me, truly loved me, then none of this would be happening. Mrs. Potts and Cogsworth would be here. The animals in the maze wouldn't have attacked me, and I wouldn't look like this. Look at me. Every day I grow uglier, more wretched. Nanny put her arm around Tulip, who was crying so hard she couldn't breathe properly, let alone say anything in her defense. Though, even if she had, he wouldn't have heard her. His anger was growing completely out of control. I can't stand the sight of you. I want you out of my castle this moment. Don't bother packing your things. He rushed to the ladies, grasped Tulip by the hair, and pulled her toward the door, knocking over Nanny in the process. I won't have you in the castle another moment. Do you understand? You disgust me. Tulip was weeping harder than ever, screaming from the prince to let her go so she could see to her Nanny, when Gaston came into the room. What on earth is going on here, man? He wrenched Tulip from the prince's clutches and helped Nanny to her feet. What are you playing at, sir? Are you deranged? Then turned his attention to the ladies. He said, Go to your rooms, ladies. I will take care of this. The ladies waited in their rooms with their bags hastily packed. They had no idea what to think of the entire matter. Clearly the prince was suffering from some sort of fever from his wounds and exhaustion. They sat in silence until Lumiere came into the room. His face looked grieved. Princess, I see you have packed your things. If you and Nanny could follow me, I will escort you to your carriage. He could see the numerous questions written on Tulip's face. We think it's best you go home to your mother and father. The prince will write you when he's feeling more like himself again. Nanny spoke. Yes, I think that is best. Come now, child. All will be well, I promise. And the ladies walked through the castle and into the courtyard to meet the carriage with as much dignity and composure as they could gather in light of their terrible ordeal.